Okay, we're almost at 9:01. So do you take roll call or have you already?
I have a roll.
You have it all? Excellent. Well, that's handy. Great. Call meeting to order. Welcome everyone. It's going to be good, robust discussion, I am sure, today. So thanks for all making the time. And I start by, we acknowledge and respect the Indigenous people with whom traditional lands we are meeting today. And I call for adoption of the agenda. Moved and seconded. Any discussion on that? Any additions that we need? Not seeing any hands. All those in favor? And none opposed. Moving on. Receipt of the minutes, January 10th, 2025, West Transit Service Committee minutes have been received. Is there any errors, omissions, or anything anyone needs from those? Not seeing it? Okay, moving on. So we basically have two things on the agenda today. One is to talk about values and cost for transit, and from that make some decisions on how we want to direct staff going forward. So they're pretty intertwined, but really when we discussed it, thinking about we need to know what our values we're anchoring to those cost decisions are. So we're going to start there. But like I said, they're pretty intertwined. So I will hand it over to Tom. I believe he has a presentation for us. I will be monitoring chat. Make sure you put your name in chat and don't use your hands because I can't see you. Great. All right, over to you.
Good morning. My name is Tom Duell. I'm a research analyst for the Regional District of Central Kootenay. Today, we're going to have a conversation that starts in part with the values and apportionment, and then leads into themes, values, and service levels. So how we get from where we are now, or a potential critical path from how we get to where we are now to where we want to be, and where we want to be is where we can look at changing service levels and see how those service levels impact the costs of the service to each service participant. As you're all aware, we had Watt Consulting do an interview with participants in this of this committee regarding transit services to establish some parameters. We call them themes and values. The goal there was really to find the commonalities. Now, we've attempted to apportion the costs of transit in the past, okay? And we were successful in apportioning the costs of transit for Castlegar I and J and for Creston. And the apportionment of those costs used a criteria-based approach, okay? Where we looked at ridership and transit opportunity and a couple other things and used a combination of those things in order to divvy up the costs of those services. In reviewing the information that we had, what I really found was that worked extremely well for Castlegar and Creston because they're very similar setups. You have a municipality at the center, and then you have some small services going into the rural areas, pulling people into town, and the vast majority of the services are actually found in town. So there are agreed upon criteria, there are agreed upon ways to divvy up those costs because there's a limited number of service participants, and everybody can kind of see the service that they're getting and that sort of thing. When we tried to port that approach over to S239, which involves all those participants at this committee, it didn't work. And one of the reasons it didn't work was because, again, we have these competing values where some people are offering small localized services within municipalities. Some people are offering big distributed services across the board. There are local connectors. So there's all kinds of different things. So it made it very difficult to pick any one approach that could be applied. So that's a bit of the background. And again, to highlight that this committee has been, the participants of this service have been trying to find a way to apportion these costs for the past 4 years. So I'm going to start with themes and values. If you want to hit the next slide for me.
I'm too far. One back.
One back.
There you go.
Okay. So we've identified some central themes, and I want to No, that's okay. This actually works. We really tried to put some of the themes up across the top bar, okay, when you look at it, and then see how those themes apply to what we're proposing, okay? Now, I want to check really in one moment. Again, these themes were actually arrived at through a series of interviews. The Watt Consulting contacted 16 members of the community, tried to reach out to everybody. Everybody was not always available. And then tried to synthesize sort of commonalities, things that are shared or ideas that are shared by all or most of the members of the committee. And the idea of starting with themes or values is, let's start with the commonalities and then try and turn those into the math, as opposed to starting with the math and then trying to create values out of that, which was sort of the reversed approach we took in the past. So I'd like to talk about a few of the values. Maybe what we'll do is we'll put it up on the screen, talk about it, and then if there's any comments on that given value or any concerns with that given value, we'll talk about it there, and then we'll move to the next one. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay. Transit funding methods should be simplified and well documented, because that's something we don't have right now. We don't have a simple method. Transit funding is opaque. We have percentage amounts in a bylaw, but we have a bylaw that doesn't state anywhere how we got to those amounts, okay? So participants of the service have no assured mechanism for the distribution of costs, and we need to create that in order to move forward. If you want to change service levels, whether increase or decrease, there's no mechanism for associating a cost to that right now. And so that's where we'd like to go. Next slide, please. Unless there are any questions about that.
Questions? Not seeing.
Okay. Now, I want to note in here, the cost of the 99 will be distributed by population and will include 500 hours of Health Connections funding. Okay, so this is one approach that we're taking. In the preferred method, we've got what we call the hybrid approach. There are 3 different ways of distributing the costs of public transit in the preferred method. Okay, the first is the costs associated with the number 99. And what the consultant has proposed is that we distribute those costs by population. Okay, the 99 is critical, because otherwise it's kind of buses to nowhere to a degree. Like, we would have small localized services centered around our communities, but no way of moving people across the entire area. What we've done that's a little different from what the consultant proposed, though, is we have added 500 Health Connection hours into that, okay? We have always used Health Connections funding to cover some of the costs of the 99, but we've hard-coded that cost in at this point, okay? That number is adjustable. So then we also, if we want to look at this, the cost of conventional routes, such as the number 10 North Shore, the 14 Perrier, the 15 Blewett, and the 20 Slocan, these are our big regional subconnectors. We're distributing those costs by ridership. We're using UMO, which is our digital pay system, okay? And we're using new onboard counters, okay, to take on where are people getting onto the bus, okay? So we're looking at boarding data particularly. We get this information from BC Transit. This data is sampled. I will caveat that, okay? We can't look at a count of everybody who gets on the bus all the time and come up with a number. We actually use sampling, sort of narrow those curves a little bit, but we've applied that to this information. Lastly, annual service hours divided by the number of participants times the average annual cost. So what we're looking at is the cost of paratransit routes, including the number 51 Nakusp, 52 Playmore, 53 Nakusp Edgewood, 57 Caslow Local, 58 Caslow Argenta, okay? These are sort of smaller routes that you're familiar with, but what we're doing with the distribution of these costs is we're saying that for these smaller routes, it's even distribution among all the partners because it's the benefit there is to each of those communities. So for example, the Caslo local, which goes into Caslo and out of Caslo and back into Caslo, that would be split evenly by Area D and the village of Caslo. Okay. Next slide, please.
I think we have.
Oh, sorry.
Yep, no, it's okay. We'll ask questions on that slide. Director Watson and Greg in the chat. She just popped in.
Okay. So a couple questions on this one. First of all, our new website is the first time I've been able to see what is the actual schedule. It was a little more easy for me to understand because I did not know what the what was provided to Area D. I thought it was 1 day a week. I've learned there's actually 3 days a week that goes from Caslo south of Area D to Caslo. So that helped me understand a little better. I just want to acknowledge that. But my question is that actual access to the larger system for 2/3 of my area is limited to 1 day a week. So when you go by population, I'm a bit challenged by that because there's 6 days a week, they don't have access to that larger system. And it's quite a geography. You've got a good 60 to 70 kilometers for them to even get to the larger system. So was there any assessment of actual access to the larger system based on those connector routes that bring them in, opposed to population based?
So what happens, particularly with the health connection from Caslo to Nelson, is actually a Caslo to Balfour bus, which I think is what you're talking about, right?
I'm talking about, if that's okay, if we go back and forth, I'm talking about like the Caslo South has a lot more going on and that looks pretty robust. It's north of that, which is the bigger part of the connecting route, which is going up to Argenta. That's 1 day a week.
Yes. Yeah. And so the Caslo Argenta route is split evenly 50-50 Caslo Area D on the costs of that. Now, is your question around service levels or?
My question is, if they can only access that system 1 day a week,
Yes.
then I don't think 50-50 is the adequate, or population based is the adequate way of doing that because they can't access it 6 days a week without finding another way of getting into the primary system. So that was my question when you're looking at the different allocation models. There's nothing here identifying that if your connecting route, which is 60 kilometers away from getting to the primary system, is only accessible 1 day a week, that's not 50% access.
That's a good point.
So suggesting a different allocation model.
So you would prorate, you're suggesting to prorate by access, which is much more complicated,
I know.
right? Like if you can, how do you say that this group of people in that area north of Caslo can only come in, like what happens if they take a car into Caslo and then take trips out of Caslo to Balfour to get on the 10, to get to the 99, to get to, admittedly, it is a long stretch. Director Jackman has the exact same thing going on, right? They have to get on a ferry. Yeah.
I just wanted to note that the allocation model is not addressing that, like in some areas that are paying same amount, you have 3 days a week versus 1 day a week. And so they're having to add in a whole other aspect to getting to the system.
Yeah.
And that's where they don't bother with the system and it keeps ridership low. So we either enhance the amount of times they can access the system or we change the allocation model to address that they can't get to it more than 1 day a week.
Which speaks to a value that was identified as well. I'll bring it up a little early, which is transit should be frequent and reliable. And that's a problem that we face across the entire system. To be honest, I look at the scheduling the way it currently works right now, and it results in sort of inconsistency, right? Which makes it very difficult to plan moving forward, right? Like your schedule from Caslo down to Balfour, it's got 3 different types of service crammed into 3 different days. Like, oh, this one only runs on Wednesday. This one only runs on Tuesday. This one runs Wednesday, Tuesday, Thursday. That one runs Wednesday, Tuesday, Thursday as well. Like, it's very difficult to plan around those things. It's an area where we need to look at service level change in order to render those schedules consistent. But we need a tool for apportionment in order to do that, which is the conversation we're having currently. I will make note of that and look at and try and figure out how that might look, how we might proceed with taking into account reduced access from remote areas. But but there may be a conversation around what constitutes reduced access at the committee level, right? Like it may be to the committee to establish, okay, what's a barrier and what's not. Right.
Final comment on this one?
Yep.
What I want to highlight is, like, I would love to be able to acknowledge that the system's not accessible 6 days a week to, 2/3 of the area. That doesn't mean that the system doesn't, that the system is actually what needs to change opposed to the apportionment model. That if it was more accessible and easy to use, then you'd increase ridership. And it is where, when you have people so far out, they're the more likely ones that are going to need a transit system. Than, not saying like what I did determine happens Castle South was quite incredible, but it was our website that helped me figure that out. I couldn't figure it out on the BC Transit one. So there's quite a bit of access once you get down there on those days. So I'd be open to either or. Because we're doing an apportionment model right now, I think the amount of days you have access to the larger system is an important value. Thank you.
Director Graham.
Thank you. So, to Amy's point, I'm gonna say, like, I also have residents that are on the other side of the ferry in Harrop and Proctor that have zero access. They have to somehow get across a ferry to access the system. So again, but my question to staff through the chair is around this Health Connections funding. You've said include 500 hours. Like, how many total hours do we have available of Health Connecting funding, and how did we get to 500 hours for this?
Respectfully through the chair, we have $196,000 a year that comes in annually from Health Connections. Our original agreements with Health Connections stated that they were supposed to cover a certain number of hours. Now, what happened was that funding got frozen in 2022 when COVID had hit, okay? A lot of our funding was frozen as well. The provincial government was putting all kinds of money into public transit. So we looked at that and we said, well, we're getting all this money from the provincial government to cover these costs. We understand why the healthcare system, Health Connections, is putting a hold on that. And we proceeded. Now, what we noticed in 2023, 2024 was that they had not increased their funding. They maintained the lock on their funding, and their funding was not increasing anywhere near what the costs of transit were increasing. As you recall, substantive increases from 2023, 2024, 2024, 2025, and what we're looking at in 2026. So, RDC case, West Kootenay Transit staff and BC Transit have been working with Health Connections to try and get that funding unlocked and to try and get it increased. But over time, what's happened is there's no real connection between the level of funding and the number of hours it was supposed to fund in the past. So effectively, what's happening is local government is funding a larger part of the transit system, and Health Connections is funding a smaller part of the transit system. So it affects everyone with Health Connections in the community, which are most of us. Does that answer your question?
What sort of, like, supplemental? So if you have $196,000 per year, like, how many hours does that translate into?
I'm looking at the cost of transit over the whole thing right now because I used 2024 numbers because that was a complete budget. So I had a full model to work with. We haven't completed 2025. So I used the 2024 numbers. I said the cost of an hour of operations of transit worked out to about $193. That's full cost, okay? So that includes me, that includes maintenance, that includes BC Transit contract, that includes shelter snow removal, replacing signs, all of it. So what we did is we took that number, we came up with a base number of BC Transit sort of Health Connections hours. We looked at the service participants who were receiving Health Connections, sort of the more standalones like the 70 series. We did an even cost split between the service participants and IHA, effectively treating IHA like a local government partner. We had a balance of funds left because everybody participates in the number 99. That was one way of reducing everybody's transit service costs, was supporting the 99. And we have an agreement with IHA that we are supposed to be supplementing some of the 99. So I believe this pays for about 2 99 trips.
Director Graham, you good?
Just one more supplemental, if I may. Just,
Yep, go ahead.
just with regards to this average hourly cost that you have in all of your formulas here, like, is this the average hourly cost that we were just talking about at $193? Is that roughly what we're looking for? And is this average hourly cost like specific to each of these runs, or is it the average hourly cost like over the whole service of all of the services?
It's the distribution of the cost of the whole, of all the costs associated with S238 and S239. Somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.2 million is the value we started with. Then we take the number of service hours, like how many hours of operation do we have in the system? And we divvy it up by that. And in doing so, you're also doing things like distributing the cost of me, this building, your admin fees, your IT fees, like whole cost. If you were to talk to BC Transit about what an hour of operations costs, they would give you a number somewhere between 164 and 184 an hour, depending on what sort of transit we're looking at. And that's full cost again. So that's BC government paying half the cost and us paying the other half of the cost, with IHA also paying a share of the cost, about 7%, I believe.
You good, Director Graham? So,
Thumbs up.
okay, good. Thank you. Director Weatherhead.
Thank you, through the chair, to Tom. Where I'm struggling with this apportionment cost is in the fact that our route, Edgewood to Nakusp, does not connect with the larger system in any way. In terms of health connections, or in terms of just even going to Nelson or Castlegar for any reason. And so it's really what I think what I struggle with is, because we once ran our own transit under Arrow and Slocan Lakes Community Services, and we had the flexibility to offer, I've got about 2/3 of my area as well that cannot access the larger system at all, and all they just basically have is one bus that runs down my southern region and back on a Friday, just for grocery shopping, and maybe some doctor's appointments in Nakusp if that's the case. So it isn't feeling like an equal distribution to me, but I may not have a full understanding of it.
I just wanted to point out, so if we look at what, if you're talking in terms of the number 99, is that what you're referring to?
Actually, maybe I'm not as familiar with the number 99 because I can't access it adequately. I'm talking about, like, I've got, the only service I have is number 53, Nakusp to Edgewood. And then the Nakusp, all those Nakusp transit services, I can't connect anyone in my southern region to those other connections.
Actually, you have the 52 Nakusp Playmore, the 53 Nakusp Edgewood, and the 74 Nakusp Nelson.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Health connections. So if you look at the sum of hours of service for those, you would be looking at about 395 service hours.
Okay, sorry, I'm going to reframe this then. Maybe I'm not clear. What I'm saying is that none of my southern region, which is most of my constituents, they're going to have to drive anywhere from 45 kilometers to 85 kilometers to actually in a car to get to that Nakusp Playmore, that Nakusp Hot Springs. So the only service that we have is Nakusp to Edgewood on Fridays, which doesn't connect to anything else.
Yeah, it gets you to Nakusp, right?
It's me to Nakusp, but not on the days that there's furthering transit to take them elsewhere. And so none of the Area K residents in my southern region are able to access health connections. And other than we have under Arrow and Slocan Lakes Community Services at this time, we have a health bus that takes all of my residents and Nakusp residents to doctor appointments, medical appointments, and if there's room on the bus for shoppers, can go on their own health connection bus that is under a nonprofit. So yeah, I don't have like number 53, Nakusp to Edgewood does not connect to any of these other connections to get them elsewhere besides Nakusp.
It doesn't happen on the right day. It's
It doesn't.
yeah, it doesn't happen on the right day. And this is a question of service levels once again, right? Like, how do we distribute, and if you're not receiving service or you don't feel you're receiving adequate service, how do you change the service levels, right? And that's what this apportionment level is about. If you don't participate in a given service, right now we've listed the services that you participate in. Those are the hours distributed over Area K. And if you disagree with those, if we can agree on apportionment method, you can then change that by changing service levels.
Okay,
So I
Faith, supplemental then, how would I change it then? Because the only residents that are close enough to Nakusp to receive those others, their apportionment should look different than those in Burton, Fauquier, Edgewood, Arrow Park, because they're not in that catchment area of living close enough to Nakusp to access that service. So
Agreed. You would need a defined portion of Area K.
Yeah, and it's not laid out that way in my budget. It's just a lump sum to all of Area K, and so the apportionment doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, I agree. It's a very similar problem to what's happening in Area D right now. There's sort of a zone north of Kaslo and a zone south of Kaslo. I would argue that from Shutty Bench on down, you actually have access to a lot of services, whereas if you go over to Argenta, you don't have that much access to services. So yeah, you really, there's a defined portion of the area that's receiving more than other portions. Area E is a very similar issue. There's no transit service in Harrop Proctor, right? We did a study. It was going to be $60,000 a year to get service to them, which seemed like a lot of money at the time. It maybe, we may have to look at redefining within the bylaw, changing the requisition areas in order to fit the level of services that we're receiving. Again, that's a bylaw amendment, and that's conceivable, but we have to also keep in mind what we're actually doing to the cost of transit within the defined area. So if you load all those transit costs into a defined area around the village of Nakusp, you're going to see those costs increase. But that's a service case analysis that we can look at. You can direct that work through or request that work through this committee.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so processes, we figure out how we want the distribution, and then service level is what you're saying that they might need to change for Director Weatherheads, actually change what who's paying that allocation of that amount.
Respectfully to the chair, that's correct. It's the where you pay or the who's paying for it piece that would change there. But again, you have to agree to a mechanism of apportionment before. There is no getting around that choice. without a mechanism for apportionment, we could change who is paying, but there's no changing the amounts per se, right? If Area K pays 5%, then Area K pays 5%. That's what it says. So we have to come up with a way of linking apportionment to service level.
Director Hewitt.
Thank you, through the chair. This is, in response to what Director Watson has indicated for, Argenta north of Castle. I think if we're gonna look at the, access for Argenta, we should be considering it's only 1 day out of 3, not 1 day out of 6, because Castle only has 3 days. So to use 6 days as a baseline when Caslo doesn't have 7 days, right? It should be out of like 1 day gets you to Caslo. But Caslo only has 2 more days then, right? So that's what I'm not 1 out of 6, where 1 day of access out of 7, it's 1 out of 3.
Respectfully through the chair, we are getting into service levels. And we can't get into service levels without first having a discussion or settling on a means of apportionment. Because we have no way to achieve the things that you are trying to achieve, right? So again, we need to ensure that the conversation is about apportionment. Once apportionment is done, then we can go all the way down the rabbit hole on service levels.
Is that good? Director Hewitt, you're good? Okay. Director Page.
Listened to a lot, and I've been thinking about how you guys are thinking about these questions. So for me, this is coming down to the transit opportunity piece at 400 meters that we've currently got defined in your report, right? Like how many people have an opportunity for transit within a 400 meter cycle of a transit stop.
Respectfully through the chair, that was a criteria that we used successfully in Preston and in Castlegar. That is not a mechanism that is in the preferred method right now, in the preferred approach. They discussed it in the Watt report, and I understand their concern.
So how are we defining transit opportunity now?
We're not using transit opportunity in the proposed method. Yeah, we don't use that mechanism. Watt recommended against it. And again, I think I understand why in the context of the bigger system, which is what we're looking at, right? If we were to explode S239 into 3 different services, a health connection service, a sub-regional connector service, and a regional 99 service, we could then use criteria specifically for each of those. But there's no one criteria that translates well across all 3 of those really fundamentally different services that we're offering, right? There's nothing that works for the 99 and the blue at 15.
Okay.
We just, yeah.
So when we're thinking about the transit opportunity and how we're apportioning this cost, I'm hearing people want to see something like a daily coverage adjustment that's broken off into thirds of some kind, right? Like you get 1 bus a week, you know, you're paying 30% of what the full tilt would be. If you're getting 6, you're paying 100%. If you're getting in the middle of that, you're paying 60%, 66%, 2/3.
For some buses, right? For some buses. Some buses are based on ridership. We're proposing, like the number 10, we're just saying ridership. It's the ridership distribution that should fund that bus. And if F has 60% of the riders and E has 38% of the riders and D has 1% and Caslo has 1%, that's how we should divvy the costs. Whereas like the health connection between Nelson and Salmo, that is split 3 ways: IHA, Area G, Village of Salmo. Right? Because they all, regardless of where people are getting on and off the bus, they all receive a benefit and they all receive a portion of that health connections funding to reduce the costs.
Right. Clear about it?
You good?
Yeah.
Okay. Director Dackman, I just saw your hand, but I thought I saw your hand before. Did you have your hand up before?
Yeah, I had a.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you.
Director Dackman.
Is relevant to areas G or D North and Prairie K, and maybe it's the last question. The difficulty, you can't say 1/3 of this and that, because they share the same vehicle. And sometimes the same drivers. The day area D North gets a bus, there is no vehicle traveling beyond Caslow South. They're sharing vehicles. So there's no connectivity. That's quite unique. I don't believe you have connectivity on very many of the days in some of these routes. If you're sharing a vehicle, the day it's not running south, it's running north. Is that the situation?
In some
Some
instances.
instances. So
In
one,
some-
oh, sorry.
Yeah, in some instances. So the 99 and the 10 are usually larger capacity vehicles, right? And then we send our smaller capacity vehicles out into the more rural, far-flung areas. They're more economical. We generally have fewer riders coming in from those rural areas. They're just more suited. We also, in our smaller vehicles, have wheelchair lifts, which in case we have to do para and handy out there, we can.
So if I can, the point is, it's not a 1/3 or so many sixths or this or that. There's some days when the shared vehicle in this general zone, it's either going this way and dead ending partway back to Nelson, Casco, or it's going from Caslow towards Nelson. So you can't do the 1/3. So I do sympathize with, both the issues in areas D and K. It's nice to have that bus when it's not being used elsewhere that day, but it's kind of a dead end bus. So the opportunity is only very local shopping, period, very local. So the point might be, transit systems have all these zones. Area A has this tiny defined area, which is the only reason I'm sitting here. And maybe, say around the cusp, you need 2 defined areas. You need a more meaningful defined area in maybe an inner circle, and then you need an outer defined area because there's just less opportunity for those people. Area D North might be similar. If we're gonna rewrite a bylaw, maybe it'd be more fair based on some kind of defined area. But, yeah, it's shared vehicles, I think, are the complication. We look at where the cost to get another vehicle, we're gonna see that soon for Area A. It's huge. So you have to share the vehicle, and that vehicle dead ends in the local town. It won't take you all the way, because that route doesn't operate into Nelson that day.
Respectfully through the chair, again, really interesting points. And yes, at the time of bylaw, that is the opportunity to come up with defined areas and change things. But before we get to bylaw, we have to agree to a means of apportionment. I'm sorry, I shouldn't be laughing when I'm saying this, but it's been the work for the past 4 years is to really get to a means of apportionment.
Okay, good, Director Rockman. Director Lund.
Good morning and thank you. So my question is surrounding percent of participant ridership, and I'm hoping we can slow down a little bit just to better understand how that piece is calculated. Because I'm thinking in SOCAN's case, it could very quickly and easily be skewed if it's tied to address, or even from SOCAN as a starting point. So looking for a little bit of clarity through the chair to staff on that data point of percent of participant ridership.
Respectfully through the chair, and I acknowledge that could be a particular problem for the village of Slocan. The village of Slocan has a very high transit bill because it's an interchange point. There are buses coming down from up north. They stop in the village of Slocan. People from all over the community then get in there to address that. This is an issue that we're going to have to look at. We're going to have to talk about Village of Slocan's participation in those services. For example, do we include Village of Slocan in the Health Connection service? That's an interesting question, right? Like, yes, technically the bus does go by. Does it have to go into the Village of Slocan? I would suggest this is probably a conversation for Silverton, New Denver, Village of Slocan, and Area H about the distribution of these costs. The other 3 jurisdictions, Silverton, New Denver, and Area H, do benefit considerably from having the interchange point there in the village of Slocan, we will have to look at that distribution. I understand your concerns around the costs. It is substantive. Now, there is also a lot of transit service. So there will have to be some conversations at a later date too about what those service levels look like.
Director Lynn?
Yeah, supplemental, just curious as well, the percent of participant ridership.
It's based on boarding information, respectfully through the chair.
Sorry,
We look at taps. So if you have, we look at taps, we look at the records that the bus driver is keeping in some cases. Mostly it's digital now. We have APCs, automated passenger counters, on most of our buses now that just measure the number of people walking in the door on the bus and where they walk in the door on the bus. So I use BC Transit sample data, but again, it doesn't get at where the resident is. It gets at where they got on the bus.
yeah, so sorry, in response through the chair, just I am cautious about using that in a calculation. Just because rural addresses or they say Slocan, but it include a significant portion of Area H if it's based on address. There's a lot of folks who may have alternatives, even kids coming to the school, for example, who will come up on the school bus and then stay later to play basketball and then tap off. There's also folks from Area H who will walk up the rail trail, buy their groceries, and then jump on the bus with their groceries. So really flagging a little bit of a concern, actually a huge a concern about that percentage of participant ridership in the calculation for Slocan.
Respectfully to the chair, your concerns about addressing is not really an issue.
Okay.
We don't have your address on the card. Again, we just know where it tapped, right? So it's a pretty high level of tapping going on in the village of Slocan for all the reasons you just stated. And I want to note as well, like one of the identified values that the committee found was transit is a social service.
Mm-hmm.
And everything you just described, like kids getting to school, people getting to events, people getting to services, it's working there in that instance. All those things you described, it's just unfortunate that I don't think the way the costs are currently distributed or the way the costs appear to distribute in this model initially are not equitable. And so again, I think we can have a conversation with the service partners in that area and have a look at a way of making it more equitable. We can pick a model, but there's always going to be changes to that model. It has to be a living model. The problem was before somebody made a decision a long time ago, they put that decision in a drawer someplace. Nobody knows where it is. We don't have the logic behind it. So any decision that the committee makes or any decision that the board makes goes into a bylaw from here on in so that the person who stands in this place in the future can just open up that bylaw and say, this is how they came to that distribution. And if we have to make changes to the model to reflect a more equitable distribution of costs around the services that the village of Slocan is involved in, we can do that.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Again, we're about 8 blocks. There's a lot of population outside of that 8 blocks. So it's, we'll work to do with the service participants.
Yes.
Thank you.
Director Lockwood?
Thank you. So there's been some things that have been brought up already. So as the last director said, that there's a lot of people that have SAML addresses, that the only bus stop is in SAML. So you may have to come all the way from Nelway, come into SAML to be able to get to Nelson. So that person has to hitchhike or drive a car. The other thing is how does the fare? So this is something that I have spoken about is we keep going down in fare, the amount it costs, where the transit keeps going up. And we keep saying that this is something to, I'm not really sure, but I want to know, as you said, SAML, Area G, and IHA are a third. So there's 1%. Is that what the fare is? Because there's 33. So we're at 99, is the 1% from the fares?
Uh,
Or how does that?
Yeah, it's
factor
30,
into it?
so fares, revenue comes right off the top of the distribution of costs, right? And so I understand what you're saying, respectfully through the chair. I understand what you're saying, particularly with that health connections route, because it used to be $4.50.
Mhm.
And we changed fares to $2.25, but the revenue pickup that we got on the 10, revenues are up, right? Even though we took our health connection services and just made them $2.25, so everybody could use the card. That was for convenience. The loss of revenue on those health connections routes is quite like, it doesn't stack up at all to the revenue made on the 10, the 99, the 20, the 53, like those bigger routes. It's just not much of a loss. In terms of distribution, those health connection costs, it would be 33.33%. Any kind of revenue coming in off that service, again, comes right off the top. When I say $1.2 million to fund service S238 and S239, it would be more than that if I did not discount the revenue.
Okay, so supplementary is, I'm wondering, is that what we as local government are looking at, is how do we totally fund this by taxation? Cause that's where I feel that that's where we're headed. And I don't get funded for my vehicle by taxation. So I'm just wondering, as we sit here as a committee, is that what our goal is trying to have this totally funded by taxation?
Two things, respectfully through the chair. One, another identified value by the committee, user pays. So that is a stated, like that is something that everybody pretty much universally agreed to. User pays, with the caveat that we all understand that there are some users who can't afford to pay. And those high barrier users, those are the ones it's probably most important for us to get them onto the transit system. So there's some nuance in there. The second piece is we're already in the queue for a fare review. I would expect fares to go up over the next year. After the fare review is done, it looks like there are 18 other systems in the province currently committed to fare reviews. Everybody is in a very similar boat, and it wouldn't surprise me if this time next year, the average cost of getting on a bus would be towards $3, right? But who knows?
Not even close to 450 that it was.
It's true, but because the number of rides on those health connections routes, there's so few rides compared to the rest of the system. It's the changes that we make in the rest of the system that actually impact revenues. The health connections routes are relatively small. And once again, those are the people that it's like, we want to create those opportunities to get medical care. We don't want to create barriers there. So,
But that's a whole nother story because there's lots of barriers.
yeah.
One more question is, does the bus that comes, and I'm gonna use the Salmo one, that comes out to Salmo 3 times a day, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday, stop after using that, or is it used in the system somewhere else?
Respectfully through the chair, all those buses roll all the time. If BC Transit has others, we
So
can
it's a
buy
shared
more
bus.
buses. Because our spare ratios are low, this is a very efficient system, which when we have breakdowns can be a problem. But we have used, and I'm gonna note that our partnership with the City of Nelson has made this much, much easier. City of Nelson as an operator, because they have a whole transit system running in town all the time. And we have a transit system running out here all the time. And we have the same people running both systems. When somebody's sick or there's a problem or we need parts or all those other things, we get some interchangeability. They can work with that. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm gonna jump to Director Popoff for the first time, but I do have Watson and Graham for a second time after that. So Director Popoff.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Tom, I do not envy your job trying to equalize this amongst everybody.
Nobody wants my job. Like nobody wants I can't believe this.
That's just a comment. It seems to be like a big task. But a couple of questions that I do have is something that Director Lund brought up is Area H getting on in Slocan and possibly happening in other areas like in Caswell, etc. So is there a possibility, I know a problem that would create a lot more work for the bus driver, is if when they boarded the bus that he took the address, the civic address of the person, then we actually know where they're coming from. So there'll be that, well, that would be one question. And the easiest way is basically user pay, forget taxation. And second comment is I was in Richmond at a conference, and their rate is basically what our rate is for user pay, $2 and somewhat cents, very uneven number. But in rural, you know, because the buses there run and the trains run on a regular basis, and I can understand why the user pay is so low. But in the rural area or whatever, by, you know, increasing our user pay might solve some of our problems. But I don't know how the user pay is calculated. And I think you mentioned before, it's BC Transit that basically defines what the user pay is going to be. So a lot of things to unpack there, Tom, and I don't know if you've got any answers to any of that.
Respectfully through the chair, no, it is the purview of this committee to set the fares. BC Transit will make recommendations, just in case this committee wants to make transit free or make transit $10, right? They're gonna set a set of strongly advised goalposts, and then it'll be the purview of the committee to decide where it within those goalposts, high side or low side, that they want to set fares. So there is discretion at this committee level. Regarding surveys for where transit users are, I would hesitate to do that to the bus drivers, to have them taking surveys while they're trying to produce service. Having said that, what I have seen is just posting little signs at the bus stops, and people can use their phones, or people can go to a website, or we can actually set up surveys. One of the things we need to do once we're done discussing apportionment is capture more information around the ridership. As this committee is probably aware, we do have the Rural Mobility Working Group lined up now. And I've been working a lot with Alex to talk about what that might look like in the future and how we might better engage transit and other mobility users to create a transportation ecosystem that is more suited to the rural area.
Are you good, Director Popoff?
I've got a lot of supplementals, but I'll just leave it to other people to ask questions.
Okay, great. Let me know if you want to be back on the list. Director Watson.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, this is the second time we've been able to actually really talk about the transit system. So it's incredibly helpful. I really appreciate the time to work through how does this work. So thank you to both of you. What I wanted to clarify is when I made the recommendation on a metric and apportionment for days of access to the larger system, I was using D as an example, but I would say that applies to any area that doesn't have full access on a regular basis. So I wasn't saying Castle should stick to the usual. I was saying that's a metric we can include in the apportionment model to address access to the larger system. So wanted to clarify that. I did want to know, based on what Director Jackman was asking, and perhaps this is something I've just seen that I don't understand, but as far as I've seen physically in the community, the bus sits at a private residence the rest of the week that goes up north. So it is sitting there, or perhaps it's the one, I don't know, I've just noticed it sitting in Upper Castle quite often. So there probably is opportunity to use it at other times, but it would require changing the service. And last note, just because it was just mentioned, I really think the rural mobility, Alex, he is on the line, I noticed, but that's a conversation that we should be having here, because when BC Transit did the public engagement, that did not qualify as public engagement. And I really feel like for me to understand how to make recommendations on a service, I need to engage my residents. I try not to do that as a director because there's all sorts of considerations. But that's a great tool. I hadn't thought of our MAC, the Rural Mobility Committee, Accessibility Committee, thank you. Being a tool to do that, but I think that would be a great opportunity to see that committee understand what the residents are saying. We can talk about it at sustainability where it is on the agenda, but part of my concern with that committee is understanding the system, which we are just getting used to. So when you do public engagement, whether it's through that committee or just as members of the public, they can make recommendations but not understand what we're working with. And so I think there needs to be a lot more cross-sectioning between what that committee might be doing, what we do have as transit, the complexities of it, and then take that so that when they make recommendations to us, it's relative to what we can consider, not lofty ideas that we then need to be a jerk saying, sorry, I could never do that. So there's a lot of details in there, but it's my summary of notes.
Do you have any thoughts on the busing, the bus consideration for area D, the one bus that seems to be not being used?
Yeah, respectfully through the chair, there is a bus parked up there. It was really hard to find a place to park that bus, because the other option is to bring the bus here. And that would add, they used to do that, and what it does is it creates multiple deadhead hours over the course of the week at a time when transit service hours are actually at a premium. So that bus, you're correct, it is parked there. Now, having said that, you know, again, could we do other things with the bus? How could we realize better efficiencies? I mean, really, the Caslow to Nelson schedule is terrible. And that needs improvement. So if there is a bus sitting there, there's good leverage to work staff, to work with BC Transit to say, hey, the bus is up there. Why doesn't it come to town Monday, Wednesday, Friday? But again, that involves engagement with the Rural Mobility Working Group and some other people, because that bus may come in. Somebody put some thought into this. I know somebody did, and it might be because the dialysis machine is open that time, or like something is happening in town at that point, or there's some reason that people need to get here at that time. So before I go taking things apart, we need to, like, again, engage people like the Rural Mobility Working Group, Health Connections, the college, all these players to be like, all right, who's using this thing and why are they using it? And then if we're getting a resounding, oh, we did that because back then this used to happen, then we can start taking it apart. But I want to be very cautious when we change transit service routes, we profoundly impact people's lives. There is somebody who will be profoundly impacted.
Yeah, go for it. So I was just noting, based on Jackman's question about the bus, I don't have a problem that it's up there, that's great. But it is up there, and if we can improve it, I do know the Thursday route going north was related to, and is related to, the food hub hours.
There you go.
So that is a localized one that it is being met. It just means that it's not able to get to the rest of the system. So we're really paying for that back and forth, where a lot of people just get rides. Okay, thank you.
Director Graham.
Thank you. So through the chair, and I appreciate all this information, and I'm this is a complex service, so I'm trying to understand this. So my question is really around the budget. Like, I've listened to you, Tom, say that 50% is paid by the BC government and 50% roughly from the RDCK. So I'm looking at our budget for S239. And I'm trying to understand, like, is this half the budget? Like, and what is grants? Is the grants the interior health money? Like, I'm just trying to understand this. And then it's confusing again, because the rate per thousand varies, substantially. So when we are talking about this apportionment, I'm trying to understand what we're trying to do here. Are we trying to come up with one rate per thousand? Like, I just need some clarity on what we're trying to achieve.
Especially through the chair, one of the big drivers behind this was Area E coming forward and saying, this is way too confusing. S238, S239, S237, S238 is split into two different services, and there's multiple rates within those services. This makes no sense. And so in taking that seriously, what we're really driving towards with this method of apportionment is taking everything and putting into S239, that budget, okay? So service participants should be able to open bylaw the service for bylaw S2, the bylaw for service S239, turn the page and see the percentage of transit costs that they are paying and a rate of apportionment. So that is the end goal. S238 would exist only to levy taxation on Old E, Old F, and Old H. That's it. There would be nothing of any interest to anyone besides the area directors from E, F, and H. So we are pushing towards simplicity. The numbers, you don't see the discount or the 50% that BC Transit pays within our budgets, because it already comes off the top. We get a local government we get the local government share of operating costs, which is the technical term for it. The grant funding that you are looking at in the budget is the IHA Health Connections funding. I believe it's somewhere around 196,000 a year.
Okay, no? Director Graham, do you have supplemental?
Thank you. So that makes sense to me because of the old E, the old H, that stuff's all been annexed by the city. So that's really just the amounts that the city is collecting on behalf. So I get that. But these amounts in the grants are not they're 220 for 2025, they're 224,000, not 196,000.
Oh, respectfully through the chair, because this is based on, so you're looking at the 2025 budget. I'm talking about the 2024
Okay.
budget because everything I have done, because that's a complete calendar year with all the financing in it. Those are the numbers I'm using. The 2025 is based on a proposed number for Health Connections. That's the funding we should be getting according to our agreements. We're still working on confirming that funding is coming.
Okay. Thank you.
Great. Okay, I'm not seeing anyone else on the list. So clear, just for process out of this conversation. Today, we're trying to give you as staff direction on apportionment. How are we going to do this going forward? Next step would then be going into bylaw of local services. And does the service level now agree with what the needs are and the apportionment that's there and making adjustments? Is that kind of what your process is going to be?
Yeah, respectfully through the chair, there are two options for apportionment presented in the report. If the committee chooses one of those two options, I would anticipate at the next committee meeting, which I believe is scheduled for May, to come back with a bylaw that captures current service levels at those apportionments and then begin the discussion of the impact of service levels on apportionment and costs. So that bylaw would give sort of a more focused picture. That bylaw would not have to go to board until this committee was ready. It's once the committee is ready with the method of apportionment and the current apportionment of costs reflecting service levels and a plan about service levels, that's when this can go to board.
And so today we're trying to get the first one.
The target date
Yeah.
to have this all wrapped up would be October.
Great. Just so we're clear, when the conversation of what the goal is for today, Director Graham, I hear your point of what's the goal for today. So the goal for today is that first tier. The next one will be looking at the bylaw and like you said, and then the next one will be the third is actually finalizing those service levels. Okay, Director Weatherhead.
Thank you through the chair. Then if the goal is for what you just said, sorry. But yet this report is based on 2024 as Tom has just pointed out, then that graph being used to determine, I'll just use Area K as an example, it went up from 22,000 to 30,000 just by our budget. So now where's our baseline going to be at that 30,000 and then the apportionment's going to go up from there? Does that make sense?
Respectfully through the chair, it does, and I appreciate your concern on the matter. The distribution of costs associated with service, that's what percentages look like based on this model. Can I make some changes to this model? Absolutely, based on the direction of the committee. It sounds like we already have some very interesting ideas around creating defined areas. We also have some interesting ideas about access to the number 99 on given days or timeframes around it, which we can do with the model.
Thank you.
Director Lund.
Thank you. I don't know if now's the appropriate time to ask this question, but I don't completely understand why the village of Slocan is being removed from the Slocan Valley service.
Sure. Respectfully through the chair. The reason being is that we're moving all the costs of running the number 20 into S239. We're taking everything out of S238. Only thing S238 is going to do is levy taxation for old E, old F, and old H. That's all. If we fold up S238 and the bylaw associated with it, we may lose the ability to tax those lands annexed by the city of Nelson. That bylaw was done at that time. It's sort of written into the whole agreement with the city of Nelson regarding the annexation of those lands. Village of Slocan receives no benefit. So having received no benefit from it, there really is no point in keeping the village wrapped up in that bylaw. We, again, for simplicity's sake, we can move everything that the Village of Slocan does into one bylaw, as opposed to having it all reside in two. It does nothing to change your costs or your revenues. It just hopefully simplifies things at the end of the day.
Quick supplemental. Is it possible to change the name of the service once we do that? It just feels really counterintuitive explaining that to the public.
Respectfully through the chair, yeah, I'm sure we could change the name of the service, and again, like there'll be no impact on service levels.
Mhm.
There won't be, nothing changes for the public at that point.
Okay.
It's just, Village of Slocan has one less budget to contemplate.
Okay, thank you.
Director Page.
Yeah. Looking at the model 4, which is maximum cost, base fee, mileage, and rate your share of partnership, which is what is recommended. When we're talking about those rural areas, is the base fee, as I'm looking through the report, I'm not quite clear where we calculate that out when we're dividing it across. Is this a place in the base fee to contemplate, the percentage of population that doesn't have 7-day coverage or 6-day coverage, or having a rural component within that, or is the thought afterwards that we can just as easily keep this model 4 and that base fee, and where necessary, just carve out defined areas, and that's just as easy or clearer in the end? Or
Yeah.
do we deal with it here at the base fee, or do we just expect that we're going to do a workaround later with defined areas?
Respectfully through the chair, and that's one of the reasons why Model 4 doesn't really work, and we've gone with the hybrid model number 5, as noted in the report. That base fee, we attempted something similar to that base fee in the past, and for all the reasons you just named, people struggled with it, right? Like, I considered base fee something to absorb the administrative costs of the service, right? Like, everybody receives service from me, from this facility, the costs associated, IT. So you could distribute that evenly as a base fee. But even then, at that point, it starts coming to service levels. Eventually, it takes much more time to deal with transit service issues in areas E, F, H, City of Castlegar, right? Like these big users. So why should Village of Slocan or say Village of Salmo, or Caslo pay the same base fee? It just that model 4 works really well for, or something very similar to that model 4 works really well for Castlegar, works really well in Creston, because they're just these homogeneous systems. They don't have the granularity that this, like, again, S239 with these buses going everywhere. Something like that would work really well for City of Nelson, right? The apportionment of costs, if the City of Nelson was participating with services in Blewett, North Shore, and around here, we could distribute the cost that way. But once you take into account the health connections, the paratransit issues, like all these other fundamentally different kinds of service, I don't think it captures it well. And I think that's why the committee stumbled with it last time.
Yes. Okay, so we've made it through 2 of the values. We're moving on
Still going.
to number
Go ahead, hit the slide.
3. That one's working. It's just not that one. Go back one. There you go.
New funding models should explicitly state how the cost is arrived at, so the math should be transparent, and there should be principles behind it. And I think we've actually been talking a lot about those principles, and over the last hour. This is all very good and very useful information. that can help build an even more robust model. Next slide, please. Oh,
Yep,
questions?
Director Lockwood?
Very quickly, I know that it says number of service participants. And I know that we dropped into a hole during COVID, wasn't being used. 2024, they're saying that we're kind of back to our service level. Now, what happens if we all of a sudden drop again and we've already put a number in there of what we're expecting?
Oh, sorry, service participants refers to local government service participants, so.
Thank you.
CASL area, it's not ridership, I understand the confusion, there's a lot of
Okay.
terms here, but we're referring
Thank
to
you.
local government participants. We go to the next slide.
Any other question on that one? Not seeing any. Nope, we're good.
Okay.
Sorry, that's doing
A multifactorial approach to the allocation of transit costs, and here we have an explanation, regarding the difference between Model 4 and Model 5, and why we really selected Model 5, or why staff feel that Model 5 is actually the stronger model and more suited to this approach. You should note that in the WAT report as well, though, when they filled out all the blanks for us in the other models, 1 through 4. They put all the numbers in and gave us a nice, clean answer. Model 5 is actually the messiest, because we have to make decisions based on all 3 sort of tiers of transit that we're operating, and some of the concerns the committee has raised. It already helps to address them. Unless there are any questions, next slide. Okay. Current proposed apportionments. So yeah, this is the current apportionment of 2024 costs. And then if we took those costs and reapportioned them based on preferred model number 5, right? And what you can see is, big still pays big, small still pays small. There is some variability certainly within those costs. And, again, I understand one of the things that the committee sort of observed as a theme or reported to WAT Consulting was that there were 2 things that really mattered when we were looking at the cost of transit. There was the cost to individual participants as well as the cost of the system as a whole. And so I'm really trying to keep an eye on those and not, when we look at particularly Village of Salem is a great example because it's a 400% increase. That is a substantive increase in public transit costs, right? And so what I would propose if bringing forward a bylaw is that we look at a transition period to get to equity as well. The length of that transition period would be the purview of the committee. I would recommend something in the order of 4 years. And so that, you could again, eat those costs 25% at a time until we get to equity. That's certainly how we implemented apportionment changes in S237 and in S234 Castle Garden area, Crestman Transit, and it seemed to be successful. Are there any questions?
Yeah, Director Weatherhead.
I thank you. When I look at this, sorry, through the chair to Tom, when I look at this and I see the NACUSP going down from 5.2% down to 2.8, yet Area K jumping up from 1.9 to 2.4%, again, the defined Area K residents sort of fall in line with the NACUSP apportionment than they do the Area K apportionment. So this one confuses me again.
Do you know why? I think that's probably what she's wondering is the why.
Sorry,
why
yes,
why-
I'm not
yeah,
being
why-
clear. Yes, why is that?
Yeah. So you were comparing Area K going from 1.9 to 2.45
And the cusp.
and NACUSP, and you're wondering why doesn't NACUSP change or why didn't NACUSP go up?
No, what I'm trying to illustrate is that the defined portion of Area K actually fits closer in geographically to the village of NACUSP. And you're using those village services, like meaning those NACUSP services, because they have more easier access to it. And I believe even it stops up at the Hilltop grocery store, which is in Area K. Well, it's actually in the village still, but it's Area K residents can access the stop there, or they used to be able to. I'm not sure if that's still available. And so I'm just wondering how, this is balanced. It doesn't seem balanced to me between the actual ridership of that Nakusp service, because I would say that there's probably defined Area K within that ridership way more than even the Area K Southern, because as I say, they do not connect to any of those other Nakusp buses that go out to the southern part of RDCK.
Respectfully through the chair, if there was a defined Area K, you would see those costs change. But there is no defined Area K.
That's right.
That's where we're at right now. And I have to work, when I create the model or when we work with the model has to deal with what we have. Right? That's why I have to use a complete budget year from last year. That's why we sort of use the service definitions that we have now and stuff. If you want to engage in the conversation of what might a defined Area K look like, we can do that. But if we cannot model on what a defined Area K would look like, yeah, absolutely, your costs would change.
Yeah, they would.
Your costs would definitely change. I'm going to say that like Area H is a very similar thing going on because there's a defined Area H and an entirety of Area H. I've just summarized the costs in terms of the entirety of Area H in order to simplify the conversation a little bit. In more in-depth conversations with the service participants in that area, they will have numbers that show defined K for sure. It's similar to including the old E, old F, and old H in the distribution of costs. They're so small. It's an outlier right now.
It is. Yes. Thank you.
Great. Director Cunningham. Director Cunningham?
There we go. I just tried, I was having a little trouble unmuting, Chair, but thank you. Yeah, my question through the chair, just talking about, I'm looking at Salmo and Area G, which of course we work together. My question is, it looks like a really large increase, but how much is it in actual dollars? The dollar difference, just for example, say this year or next year.
On the next slide.
Is it on the next slide?
Believe so.
Oh,
I think it's on the next slide. We're going to.
okay, great. Thank you, Chair.
You're welcome.
There it is.
Okay. Are you good, Director Cunningham?
Yes, that's good. Thank you, Chair. My point being, of course, is that sometimes when we look at it, really, what are we talking about? We're not talking about huge gobs of money. I mean, there might be a big difference between $5,000 and $26,000. That is 5 times as much. But in fact, in terms of dollars, it's, when I look at what other areas are paying, 119,000, between 119, 107, those kinds of things, like for the city of Nelson, I think that our changes are relatively, I certainly wouldn't, I'm not complaining about Area G's change, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Watson.
Yeah, thanks. I do note that the purpose of this portion of what we're doing is to get to the values and setting the apportionment. And generally speaking, well, I did not do this. I definitely looked at the numbers. We should be considering what is the system we're looking at putting in place to address those values and then see where the numbers fall. That being said, looking at the numbers is always what I do first. What I wanted to ask was, in terms of what you're hearing so far, Tom, what I'm hearing is none of those apportionment models are what we are going with, that we would be making a recommendation based on comment today to come back to us with a few other models. Is that correct?
Respectfully through the chair, I have proposed model number 5. Okay. And there are 2 options before the committee right now as I presented them. One is that we take the costs of 2024 and distribute them by the proposed apportionment method, and that becomes the starting point. The starting point, right? This is the distribution of costs, And then we start from there, and then we start changing service levels or managing service levels differently or making recommendations around that to then look at, okay, what are costs gonna look like in 2026? The other option is we just take the current distribution of costs, like this is how costs sit right now. There was logic behind it, somebody implemented it for a reason. And we're gonna take this as our baseline now and then use the proposed system of apportionment to distribute any new costs after that. So those are the two proposals. Now, we have heard a couple things. So, we can have discussions around, like, I think the apportionment of the number 99 based on access to the number 99 as you proposed. I think we can look at that in the model. We could bring that into the model for consideration. I think the conversation around creating defined areas, that would have to happen in the context of later, right? Like, we can look at it, we can model it, we can discuss it, but it's not going to happen in the adoption of a new S239 bylaw right now. I think that would be very challenging to accomplish. I think we would need to agree to a means of apportionment and then move forward with sort of rehiving those areas, because it sounds like there's a few of them on the list.
So, sorry, I'm confused because when you look at number 5 in the report, it's only referencing paratransit. I don't know which model you're recommending when you say number 5. And that's what I need clarity on first, to know if that's what I'm agreeing to. There's no numbers on these funding models.
Yeah, so okay, could you go, could you go back probably a couple slides for me? Keep going back, there we go. Come forward, there. Okay, so model number 5, okay, takes this approach. Okay, so you'll see 4 different formulas then, and it uses all 4 of those formulas to distribute costs, because we have one formula for the 99. We have a different formula, a different approach for health connections, because there's just some fundamentals that are different there. We have a different approach for small rural models, like the Caslow Local, Blue at 14, Perrier 15, Nakusp Hot Springs, those kind of routes. So we have a different model for those ones. We distribute those largely by participation, no health connections money in there. Whereas the health connections routes, we're going by like even distribution with health connections as a service partner. And then finally, we have those sub-regional connectors like the 10, the 20, there's a couple other ones in there that we actually distribute by ridership. And then we add them all up. We take all those metrics, we add them up to a cumulative number, right? And that would be model 5. I don't spend a lot of time diving into model 4. We've got some information in here about it, about ridership and transit opportunity and all those pieces, but the committee already rejected that approach. It didn't want that approach because it found it, looking back at the notes, it found it too simplistic. So again, all of these things feed into the model for number 5.
Okay, I think what the model he's talking about is 32 of the actual watts, whatever it is.
Oh, yeah.
It not in the report it's in the transit and values cost, that study. There's a model number, potential cost sharing model number 5 hybrid model. It's 32 of that report that he's adjusting to. Okay.
So each of these falls into one of these.
Okay, I'll read that more specifically. I want to clarify 2 things. One is, the last time we looked at the model that you're saying this committee rejected, it wasn't the committee, it was the board. And there was definitely confusion because we did not understand the system. So even knowing what that recommendation was at this moment, can't recall. So I don't want to say that was not the right model because we were at board table, we didn't understand the system. There's a lot of other considerations. And second, I don't support this model. When you look at percentage of population, that's very misleading. When you don't have population density, when you don't have distance, that's where I'm losing track of how our rural systems addressed in this. and again, I'm not gonna look at numbers, I'm gonna look at the values. And the one thing with the WAT report I did struggle with is addressing the fact that rural access, if you look at, like, if you used a metric of the cost per hour at $193 per hour, what we should also be including is when is that so significantly high that it doesn't warrant providing the service? So those are values I don't see addressed in the WAT report, nor in this system. But I'll read this report. I'll read that section again because I wasn't able to follow what model you were referencing. So I'll go back and look at it, but just looking at the slide, it's not addressing some of the factors that rural systems need to address. Where it's not equitable in terms of, like, you know, if you're 70 kilometers away from any connecting system, do we pay $500 an hour to get you there? Probably not a good use of funding, and there are other ways we could do it, which RMAC would be addressing. So those are the pieces which, you know, further convolute the conversation, but I needed to clarify what model we were recommending and where we're at this moment based on what we've heard. So thank you for that.
Director Lund.
Thank you. And if you could go back to the slide with the apportionment there. Yeah, so I'm just going to speak. I still feel like there must be something fundamentally wrong with the data for an increase for Spokane, which, yes, we are a municipality, but we are a very tiny rural population within Area H. And as this measures out, I just feel like there has to be something fundamentally off for an increase. And if you click to the next slide, as well for our small village population of 379 to bear the burden of 46,000 just in comparison to Area H. I'm struggling with that and feeling like there has to be something off with the model for it to be so skewed. For me, I'd totally support an equitable rate with Area H, especially. And I don't know if we just move the bus stop across the street so that it's in Area H, if that would make a difference, or a couple of them. But it just fundamentally doesn't make sense for our rural community. That yes, we are a municipality, but this doesn't make sense.
Respectfully through the chair, I agree. It doesn't, right? That's where we are. But when we create models, we find stuff like this. Village of Spokane is largely the outlier here. And I'm loath to throw out the baby with the bathwater in that regard. I think there are things we can do to recognize that, though. And I think that's where this committee really provides service to the ridership and to the system, is to sit down, find these discrepancies and address them. And I'd like to note, right, like, so fixed route number 20, Spokane, Village of Spokane got 10% of the cost of that. And I expect that's, you know, in distribution by ridership, that's largely because a lot of people come to the Village of Spokane to get on the bus. They come from Silverton, New Denver, and the surrounding area. Either, you know, they hitchhike into town or they get a ride into town and then they get on the bus. And I know a number of kids who do that. Then we've got paratransit Nakusp Playmore number 52, right? Which also stops. So you have 45 hours there, or 16% of that service. And then we've also got the Health Connection 74, which Village of Spokane takes 14% of that service, or 68 hours there. So, and then there's a small percentage of the number 99 service as well. So there are a lot of service hours associated with the Village of Spokane. But again, because it's sort of an interchange point, and we have to recognize the service that the Village of Spokane is providing to the riders across that entire area. If you move that transfer point to New Denver's costs would escalate rapidly and Spokane's would fall. A part of it is that you're just on the border of that defined Area H piece. Again, I'm confident that the committee can find a more equitable solution for the Village of Spokane. and we can make the required adjustments.
Okay, quick supplemental. So when we're voting today, are we voting on this apportionment? If we vote on the recommended one, because I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We have a very good system in the valley from especially Slocan South in terms of the health connection. I'm not sure if we have data on Slocan, but the one or two times when it has come through trying to get on, it's been full coming from the north end. Yeah, so I just want to really reiterate, we want to be participants and we want to pay our fair share. It is a very good service, but there's something wrong with the model right now. So I don't know how to vote.
Respectfully through the chair, and I'm going to ask that you consider like the model itself first and consider the impacts to the village of Slocan after the fact, because what I'm proposing really is if we can agree upon a means of apportionment at this meeting, I go away and write a bylaw that has the means of apportionment in it and a current distribution of costs. And then we sit down with various people and talk about how those costs might be affected. And it's at that point that we really look at the impact of those costs on the village of Slocan, right? It's at that point that Silverton, New Denver, H and Slocan sit down and say like, all right, is this equitable? How do we redistribute these costs so that effectively, reducing the impact on the village of Slocan? There's no way, if I change the model to make it work for village of Slocan, it works for nobody else. That's the problem. So again, we're gonna have to either do some sort of letter of addenda or some sort of agreement. It's to make it work for the village of Slocan. But accepting the fact that it's probably a relatively equitable distribution of costs for everybody else.
So trying to figure out how do we agree on the rule and then find the exceptions to the rule and make sure that those get put in after. But we need to agree on what the rule is.
We need to start with the rule.
And then figure out how we make those exceptions into the bylaw, which you are committing to doing with the subcommittees. I think the concern I would assume from Director Lunn is that she's making a decision today that makes sense on paper for the whole, but is she making implications for her community that it's not going to come back for another 5, 6, 7 years, and all of a sudden now she just increased their cost by a substantial amount. I'm not trying to speak for you, Director Lunn. I understand. I feel you're right. And so I think a commitment of knowing that, yes, we're making this rule today, but there is a timeline on making sure those exceptions are being fixed before we're getting into another 1, 2, 3 budget down the road. Does that make sense?
Respectfully through the chair, we have meetings in May, which I would anticipate bringing something back to the committee around that bylaw, and then getting direction to start adjusting service levels, or to begin the conversation around how do we redistribute those costs. Where this bylaw would actually go to, it would not go to the board until October. And the committee would have to be supportive of that. And then there would be another opportunity to vote at the board on as to whether or not the bylaw would receive 3 readings.
Great. Does that help at all, Director Lynn?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. Director Davidoff.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'm trying to reconcile the difference between the page we're looking at right now. So let's look at area I, where basically the current cost apportionment is $9,911.49. Proposed apportionment $13,017.41. So I've done the math, and that's an increase of $3,133. Which is 32%. So if we can go back to the graph page, please. So on the graph page, the increase is from 0.8% to 1.0, which is a 20% increase. And so I'm trying to reconcile where the other $151, the 12% comes from. And the question to Tom through the chair, is that the Health Connections piece? Or am I missing how this page reconciles with the actual amounts being charged?
Suspect that has to do with two things, health connections and rounding error. Again, when we get down below 1%, rounding error starts to have a pretty real impact. And those 500 health connections hours also sort of discount things. We don't, the health connections money gets taken right off the top right now because there's no mechanism for apportionment, right? It just gets taken right off the top. Whereas with the opposed apportionment method, the health connections money actually gets pointed straight at health connections routes and discounted from health connections routes specifically. So yeah, that's probably where you're gonna see that little discrepancy.
Supplemental chair?
Yep.
So in a future iteration, could we please have the actual split of what our, our increase and apportionment consists of? If there's the health connections amount, just all the components, because the difference between it's not a huge amount of money, just like a previous director said, but when it's 20% here, I know I'm going to get questions saying, okay, it's 20% increase, but then the actual increase when you look at the amount is 32%. I would just like something just delineating exactly what those amounts are if it's not a 20% increase. So does that make sense to the chair, to Tom?
Yes, respectfully through the chair, it does. I anticipate us having some conversations about service levels in the future. And at that point too, I would provide you with a much more succinct breakdown of your costs and sort of at the more granular level. When we're dealing with 19 different service participants and how the costs land all differently and everything, it can get pretty convoluted pretty quickly, especially for a community.
Yeah, Chair, I haven't spoken before. Could I have one more question?
Yep.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So this has to do with, I appreciate that last comment that was made. I've asked for kind of ridership by bus stop in the area. If you could provide us with as much granular data as possible, I think it would help us understand things a little better. So thank you for doing all this really tough work, and I really understand why no one else wants your job. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Director Data. I have two more on the list and then we'll take a break. So, and jump back in. Director Weatherhead.
Thank you through the chair. And I echo what David Off is saying there. Very clear as mud. Okay, so just for my clarity though, in terms of this vote, S239 is what is defined, like that is the service that Area K pays into and the Village of Nakusp pays into. So, so that's all inclusive of all of the same services, and the only one that's specifically Area K is that number 53, Nakusp to Edgewood. So if I guess, is it through this change, that this apportionment change, that now all of a sudden the Edgewood bus is costing that much more, but yet all of those buses that the Edgewood bus can't connect to, that are going from Nakusp down to the southern part of RDCK, is it, theirs is coming down? So is it just that the Edgewood bus cost apportionment is changing within S39, and meaning increasing just that one bus?
Respectfully through the chair, I think you've just hit on something really important there. I don't know why the Edgewood bus, I don't know why Area K pays what Area K pays.
Okay.
There's no formula. There's nothing there's nothing in a box. I can't pull it apart and say, oh, somebody made a decision in in 2014 that says area K should pay this much because of these many hours, or this was the color of the bus, or the bus ran this often, or any of these pieces, right? That's the problem. We have no means of knowing how we got to there right now. I know that somebody applied logic to it. I know that somebody had a plan and an idea, but they don't seem to have documented that fairly well. And this may be an aside, but I suspect what happened was West Kootenai Transit was probably intended to become a different thing. I suspect West Kootenai Transit was intended to become a commission, right? So this was a laddering point into becoming a commission. But then right in the middle of the process, the province said, no, we're not going to do any more commissions. And so everybody, we kind of got frozen in terms of how costs were distributed and how service levels were going to change and all those other pieces that would normally be in play and available. Like normally I would walk into this job, open up a folder and say like, oh, that's how we got here. And this is how we should move forward. None of that exists right now. And so we are struggling, and throw in a pandemic, right? Throw in collapse in the bus industry, throw in a whole bunch of other stuff. But at the same time, we're still working to establish this one thing, and that's the apportionment of cost, which is fundamental to any change that we want to make. So I appreciate your concerns about the cost. I can't speak to why the cost is increased. What I can say is that in model number 5 is we've taken the hours utilized by the service in area K and distributed them. The arguments that you may choose to argue, as to should area K participate in the number 99 by population? Does that make sense? Or should it be population prorated by number of days a week of service? Or should it be geographic distance? Like all these things are possible, but those are the conversations around apportionment that we really have to have those conversations before we talk about costs, before we talk about service levels, before we talk about anything else. We have to decide a means of apportionment in order to move forward.
Thank you. Supplemental, I'll just like to make a comment to point out that by this preferred apportionment, it means that the amount that Nakusp pays and the amount that Area K pays are almost the same. And that is not how it reflects in the service. I can tell you that 100%.
Respectfully through the chair, again, this is just a distribution of hours based on a model, based on service levels. As you pointed out, Nakusp may consider pivoting to a service model where they say, well, there's defined K, this buffer area around the village of Nakusp that is going to pay, more because they're receiving more of these services that are centered on Nakusp. And then there's going to be the remainder of it, like the South Area K, which will not, because they don't receive a lot of service areas. Again, that is the service level conversation. But in order to affect any of those changes, you need to have a method of apportionment. You need to have a method of distributing the costs, and we currently do not have one.
You good, Director Weatherhead? Who knows? Director Jackman, and then we'll take a break.
Thanks. Sure, put that on me.
You're holding everyone up. Keep it tight.
Talking about exchange points like Spokane. And it got me thinking about 19 years of living in Greater Vancouver. I used transit for a lot of those years, and I used 3 different parking rides. They developed a very robust system of parking ride. I walked to 2 of them frequently. I drive to the 3rd, and that was all based on just connectivity and all these things. But it made me very trackable, or it would today, because you can see in a parking lot, you can walk around with a scanner and tell who's there at what time. And that would tell you who's the benefactors are of these services, as opposed to population based, assuming benefactors. It's just an idea to throw out there. You're talking a year to get bylaws in place and maybe a 4-year funding transition. We're talking 5 years out. Parking in Nelson is tight and not getting better. Costs are high in Nelson compared to nickel and dime in some towns for free. Castlegar parking's not always very good either, unless you're kind of in a couple of spots near the Safeway. Down the road, if we actually focused on robust park and ride locations for people who drive, cycle, walk, well, drive or cycle and walk their bikes, tons of bikes at these park and rides in the coast. And then you can start to identify more accurately where people are coming from, who's benefiting, and that'll long-term alleviate some of the parking issues in these towns. So just throwing it out there, I don't think we've been investing in that, you know, maybe Spokane has the land. I think Jessica, Director Lund has a great idea, just move the thing across the road, the farm field, make it a park and ride. It's gotta be community part of the model. We really wanna attract people, make it efficient, get more people using transit out of the urban cores. We need to include that in this 5-year cycle that we're looking at.
Respectfully through the chair, the rural mobility working group. This is exactly the sort of work that community is targeting, or that working group is really interested in engaging in from very much community stakeholder standpoint. These are the people who are looking for those interfaces with the public transit system and walkability or cycling or all these, these different parts. And so, I would anticipate having those conversations with that group, and then, sort of providing a bit of a filter maybe, and then bringing that to this committee to have those discussions in the future. Like, what are the low hanging fruit, and then what are the larger projects that transit can engage in terms of parking ride or, increased stop infrastructure or
You get your extraction?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, we're gonna take a 13-minute break, come back at 11 o'clock. Okay, for those online?
There's
Unmuted. Those online, can you hear? Director Popov, can you hear us? Yeah, great. Okay. Okay, good work, everyone. We will continue on. So any other questions that we have on the previous slide or the slide that was now it's gone. Currently up with the apportionments around what it's going to look like. Okay, not seeing any. I will go over to you, Tom, to look at trying to get us to decision making today. Good luck with that.
And so we've created a little bit of space here, questions regarding the proposed apportionment method, questions regarding the implementation of the new method, questions regarding the alternatives. That are detailed in the report. First, well, yeah. Or we could bring back the berries.
So questions about any other questions we haven't captured already? Yeah, Director Page.
Okay, just so I'm clear about it. So we've gone with hybrid model 5, which is basically a series of negotiated conversations around the capability to go and have additional conversations to get to that place of everyone agreeing. But that's the big mission here is nail this down in the bylaw, get the logic laid down in some fashion, lay out a framework where we can negotiate these pieces, lay those down in future bylaws, and that'll continue to iterate forward. At some point, this committee, years from now, will discuss that and say, maybe we need to come up with something better after we wrestle with that for many years. And after we are done that, then we will have a conversation on the service level committee about, is this more, is this less, and our models will be in place so we can spit out numbers and see what taxation looks like and see if that gels. That's what we're trying to get here today. And so if we pass this model, you're empowered to go have those additional conversations with the participants we've heard from today and nail down a few other, carve-outs in the way that they make sense.
Respectfully, through the chair, staff is seeking direction on a method of apportionment. Again, without a method of apportionment, there's no way to have the other conversations in a lasting manner. We have to have an agreed upon way of associating costs with service levels before we can really have a discussion about what changes to service levels would actually do to our costs or the impacts to the ridership for that matter.
So can I move the recommendation? The proposed option? Are we at that point?
Don't know that we're there quite yet.
But yeah, I've got a few on the list, and then I think we will. Well, I think it's the next slide after this. So let's get the questions first, and then we'll move on to that for sure. And to add to Director Page, also the nuance if we're talking about certain defined areas would also be in that next level of conversation.
Respectfully through the chair, definitely would like to plan using those areas and demonstrate what the impacts of those areas are for inclusion in a bylaw this year. I think that might be challenging. I would need to have a conversation with the local government inspector about what it would take to have a defined area plunked into a bylaw and another area hived off. I think there are probably some complexities that I'm not aware of at this moment.
Okay, great. Just because that was the second layer that I've heard around.
But definitely have the conversation.
Yeah. Okay, great. Director No.
Thanks. Tom, if we go back a slide, do you mind? So do both columns add up to the same number at the end? Like if you add current and get a total and add proposed and get a total, you get the same number?
Around $1.2 million, yes.
Okay.
There might be some rounding errors. It might be.
No, it was more conceptually that I was wondering about. So if we do go with the proposed, through the chair, proposed recommendation, and there are some idiosyncrasies, if you will, how does a bylaw, how do you think a bylaw deals with those idiosyncrasies? The Village in a cusp,
village and
$30,000 difference, 50% difference, whereas Slocan concerned. So,
Sure.
and just trying to address Slocan's concern
ultimately,
and K's isn't as bad, although I hear the concerns about service. So anyway.
sure, ultimately, first you have to agree on a means of apportionment. Like, you have to say, like, this is a fair way of establishing this level of cost to this level of service.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I understand how many service hours I am getting, and I understand that this is the cost with that amount of service. And now I want to change my service level to reduce my cost.
Got it. Thank you.
What we're trying to avoid, okay, is a redistribution of costs.
Gotcha.
Right? So if we say, somebody says, I pay too much, you should take a portion of my share and give it to somebody else, but I want the same service.
Yeah.
Right? And that's what happens with the current model, because it is a percentage-based distribution. There's no getting out of it, and it creates this sense of inequity where everybody is looking what everybody else has and says, well, why do they only pay that much for that? And the same people they are talking about are complaining about their costs. So, yeah, we just have to get to a place where we can agree that this is the cost, this is my service level, this is the benchmark, and now we are going to change things up and down. We're going to do it. And again, there are two ways to do it. We can accept current costs as they are and use this method of apportionment moving forward. Or we can apply this method of apportionment to existing costs to establish a benchmark and then use the method of apportionment moving forward. It just depends on whether or not you're comfortable with the current distribution of costs, or you would like to see those costs redistributed.
Okay.
One is a quick way to feel an equitable solution. The other one is a longer road to an equitable solution. It will get you to equity eventually, but it will take a long time. There will have to be a lot of service level changes to get you there.
You good, Director Miller?
Thanks.
Director Graham?
Thank you. So through the chair, I'm just wondering, I don't know if this is the right place for this, but like, I'm wondering why cost per ridership was not part of the apportionment. Like, somewhere in the values, it was saying that the people that use it should be paying. It seems like they're paying a very small percentage. I actually think that the cost of ridership should be higher, except for like students, seniors, or low income people. There should be some kind of subsidy there. But I'm just wondering, because Tom and I had a conversation in January after I analyzed S239. When I took the user fees and divided it by $2, I had come up with a user rate of like $52.50 a person. And it would go up to $67.38 a person. But then Tom had corrected me with some data I didn't have, and that our KWP operating area cost per passenger is like $31.25 a person. So I'm just wondering how that per person cost fits into this model.
Respectfully to the chair, it does not fit into the apportionment model per se, right? It fits into the service level model, the discussion around service level. This committee may decide that it may choose to use a cost per ridership as a metric on reporting. It may say, look, you can provide a transit service route, but it's got to be below this number in terms of like cost per ride. Okay. It may choose to set those guidelines for the establishment of new routes, or for contemplating service level changes. This committee may say, we would like to see all the routes that are costing more than this amount. And then staff will provide you with that information, and then you can make decisions around service levels based on that information. That is a very important, the cost per ride is a very important number. But again, I'll go back to the values that the community the committee has identified. One of them being user pays The other one being transit as a social service, and I'll note that you mentioned students, seniors, children. That's kind of everybody riding a bus.
That's right.
That's the problem, right? Like, or not a problem. Forgive me, that was not the right thing to say. That is not a problem, but that is who our ridership are. And if the goal is to get those ridership to social services, and the committee has identified transit as a social service. We're not trying to save the environment. We're not trying to get tech billionaires on the Hyperloop to the next big meeting. We're not doing economic development. We can do those things, but it's not a stated goal, right? The stated goal is to get high barrier populations to their services.
So call it social infrastructure.
Call it social infrastructure. That makes you feel better. Go ahead.
Director Graham, do you have a follow-up?
Sorry, I'm using a laptop or an iPad. Yeah, just my only follow-up or my supplemental would be like, could we see those cost per rider numbers somewhere? Because I've never, other than trying to calculate it myself, which and all we get as directors is the budget. We don't have any of the other information, generally speaking. So is there a way that we could see that, or does the staff need a direction for that?
Respectfully through the chair, no. I have to make those requests of BC Transit. It takes them a little while to get that information together. I get annual performance summaries, but they're system-wide, so it would give you an idea of how Kootenay Lake West was functioning or the Nelson 555 operating area was functioning. If you wanted to see more detail on a route level, I'm sure we could come up with it, but it would just take a little doing. I anticipate, again, having information like that prepared for a service level discussion. So potentially what you would look at is a bar graph with all the routes going from top to bottom, showing the cost per ride. Okay, and that way you could say, okay, like this looks like a threshold, or this group of services has a particularly high cost per ride. Are we going to continue offering those services? Do we understand those services as social services? Do we see a cost benefit even though the transit cost is high? Does this ensure access to the food bank, right? So, but again, those are service level costs. Can't make any of the changes you want to make without a method of apportionment.
Great. Okay, moving on. Director Watson.
So, going by the apportionment, like again, I'm trying to find the one that would be recommended based on your report. So if I go to the report from Watt and I look at what they have outlined there, I don't agree with a population-based allocation. What I would prefer is an allocation that's based by access to the service. Because when you look at population, you're saying that everybody has the same access and they don't. When I look at and going to the social infrastructure component, if you were to do it by what the cost of the rider was, if you go north of Caslow, you're looking at $500 per trip for the amount of riders versus with the actual cost. So it's not based on population. If it's based by population, then Nelson could be more involved. No, I'm kidding. The social infrastructure falls down that road when when you can't actually use the service. So I would prefer a model that actually addresses that. And that once we know that, when we go to the service models, I do appreciate at that point, looking at the actual cost for that rider is gonna drastically impact how much are we willing to support social infrastructure and at what cost. And I'd prefer to see ridership go up than go down and shut these down. But at this time, that's the complexity to this, is people don't want to bother using it. So while we set it up so that they could get to the food bank, they still don't rely on it for the food bank, short of 2, maybe 3 people. And that's just not a good use of anybody's funding, especially on a climate change perspective. Like, yeah, hitch rides with other people. That's better for the climate. So all that to say, in terms of the current model being recommended for the regional connectors, 99, 100% population based, I don't support that one. I would rather see an allocation that's based on access to the system. which would affect CASLA, which would affect D, which would affect anyone in that system.
Respectfully through the chair, it would effectively remove some of the burden of cost from the smaller communities and the more rural areas and refocus those costs, a portion of those costs, on the municipal or the participants who exist along the corridor, because that's where the highest population is. And there's some equity in that. That there is some logic to that. I would argue that using population, starting with population, because that's a metric of actually the number of people who could potentially ride the bus, and then using that distance piece. So, and then sort of applying that to the population numbers, right? So that what you would see is like a reduced impact on those populations. So 100% of the population of areas E, F, H, what have you, right? 100% of the population applies there. But as we move away, so that like in terms of Argenta or whatever, it would actually, by the time you hit that scale drops to say 25% of the population. Does that make sense? Like, do you understand what I'm saying?
I do, but the metric for distance to, which is similar to access to, is not listed in there, so I didn't know that that was a part of it.
But the metric for, oh no, this isn't, I'm saying what this could look like based on your proposal, your idea, like how we could modify population to actually account for the distance of those populations to that 99 service. So, yeah.
It's not directly, it doesn't, because you're still saying that 7 days a week they can access it when they can't.
Nope, I'm saying, here's the 99.
It's a straight line.
Yeah, it is. And then,
Can everyone online see what you're doing?
No.
Okay.
but I'm gonna try and explain it.
Okay.
And then. Here,
Tom is making a picture, but he will explain his picture for those online.
and it looks kind of like a cow.
Weird as cow ever.
Yeah, that.
Down.
I don't know if they.
So
Clearly a city boy.
what we have is the 99, okay? And so if you have a population, let's say you have 4,200 people, and you have 4,300 people, right? And then you come up to there.
Bring that closer. Amy, come move this way. I'm just trying to let them see online, and if I bring them to
1,500 people. Okay, so you have area D has 4,200, or sorry, area F has 4,200 people. Area E has 4,300 people. Area G has 1,600 people, right? So,
Sorry, go on, sorry. Got it, I'm sorry.
so anyway, when we're distributing the cost by population, so these guys would pay 100% of that population. This one pays 100% of that population. This portion of area D,
I get where you're going.
South of Caslow pays 50% because they're one ride away. These guys up at Argenta, they pay 25% because they're 2 rides away from getting on the 99, right? And similarly, when we look at the costs associated for the village of Slocan, it does the same thing, right? Because they're 2 steps away from actually being able to get on that 99. Now, the good news is it won't have a substantive effect on the cost of the 99 because the bigger players actually pay for most of the 99 stance. Like these are the 2 and 3 percenters, but in terms of 2 and 3%, that's actually profound for their budget. If you look at what the village of Slocan pays in terms of like 2 or 3% of service, or a 1% increase is a very large budgetary increase for them. So this, in a way, addresses the overall cost of this service versus the cost of the participant, which was raised as a value by the committee. So I think we can bring forward a draft of what this might look like for consideration by the committee at the next round.
I appreciate that that way of doing it, that's great. It does in a way do it without getting too complicated, and I'm sorry, I don't wanna make it complicated, I wanna make it equitable. The only last note I'll make is that I think defined services would overly complicate it. And you would have to shift that, so I don't wanna bring in defined services into this, just as a note. If we can do it this way, I think that's more clear, and then as you change service levels, those numbers are reflected that way, opposed to then having to change bylaws that are defined services.
Respectfully through the chair, as well, this may address Area K's issue because they would be 2 rides away. So
Right.
again, we would prorate down to only 25% of the population or 25% of the cost that would normally be associated.
Okay, thank you.
Great, just for the few comments online, just make sure chat is just used for names. Sorry, I did not catch the thing about, I was trying to give you guys access to the screen if it did not work. And Tom is not giving hard numbers on who's actually included in what and what percentage. He was just giving examples, just so that no one,
Yeah, that was my fault, I'm sorry.
ends there. Great, moving on, Director Hewitt.
All right, through the chair, I'm gonna sort of justifying the numbers in my head. Everybody pays the same rate, correct? Whether they're going from New Denver to Silverton on the bus, or whether they're going from one end of D all the way to Nelson. It's all the same rate.
It costs the same amount to go from Argenta to Trail as it costs to go from Silverton to New Denver.
Okay. So where my mind is going, just if you could bear with me for a moment, is so we've got more opportunity in Caslo. We're paying the same $2, let's use that as a number, as somebody from Argenta. So the actual cost is higher, so it just shifts it from an actual fee base. Like when you go to any big city, there are zone fares. So the further you travel, the more you pay. So the citizens at the far end are paying less for that opportunity in actual dollars out of their pocket. It's going on taxation. So that's what levels it out, is that they're paying the same amount, whether you're going, 200 kilometers or 20 kilometers. So, and because Nelson and Castlegar have greater numbers of people using it, but the sheer numbers and the increased cost build into equaling it out somewhat.
Nelson and Castlegar operate municipal systems, right? Like they do a lot of transit, right? Like both of them. And again, those municipal systems are kind of required. If you're coming in from a rural area to try and get to the hospital and they drop you off at Baker Street, you need a bus to get to the hospital. You need a bus to get to the mall. And similarly in Castlegar, it's the same thing. You need a bus to get to Selkirk College, you need a bus to get to shopping and those pieces. So yeah, that's where that differentiation.
Thank you.
Director Weatherhead.
Thank you. I am very much struggling with getting on board with a equation that appears on paper to be providing the same service as the village of Nakusp, to which it is not to Area K providing the same service, because if I can't see the granular differences as to maybe just what that one Edgewood bus costs, to understand how to justify the cost for Area K residents, because we cannot connect to the hot springs, the number 51, we cannot connect to number 74, and we cannot connect to number 52. So if our Edgewood bus could connect to those, it would be a lot easier for me to see this apportionment working here, but it's just not working from what I'm seeing. I think what would work better actually is if we just had our own bus here and it would pick up people a long route to make it to those transit services, because then it would really have some value, or people could just use it to go grocery shopping in Nakusp, so rather than there being a separate Friday bus. But that just does not happen, and it would have to fall under a local society again, which actually I'll say that our local society service was top notch, how it actually functioned for our area, because we are so far off the beaten track from the rest of regional district.
Director Weatherhead.
Respectfully through the chair, agreed on that. There's like, but again, there's no way to define the cost. There's currently no way to define the cost. We cannot say, I fully understand how, you're disappointed that the model shows Nakusp getting service hours and then puts a dollar value on those service hours to say, here is a starting point. But if you look at as costs are apportioned now, there's no logic behind it. Like we don't have a starting point within which to control Nakusp's costs, or sorry, Area K's costs. If we have a means of apportionment, we can then look at those costs, and Area K can make a decision as to whether or not it wants to participate in those services or what those costs might look like in the future moving forward. But without a means of apportionment, there is no way to proceed with this. There's no way to change those costs. We could cut the service altogether. We could say there's no more service in Area K, but the bylaw still says Area K pays whatever, 2.6%. And there's no way to change it. This is the frustrating part of it.
Thank you. Through just supplemental to that, then just the same as what Director Lunn is pointing out, then if your ridership reflected which residents were actually using the service by this tally of people, to see how many people from that pocket of residences is actually even using the service, then we would actually have those metrics. Is that what you're stating?
No, I don't think ridership is 100% a magic bullet. I don't think ridership resolves all the questions. That's the criteria-based approach that we had discussed in the past. And while it may work in some instances, I don't think it addresses transit as a social service. Like, it doesn't answer the question as to why this committee wants to provide public transit. You could distribute all the costs purely on ridership, but is that ridership based on the destination to or the destination from? Who should pay for the number 99, right? Like, well, it's a lot of people coming from Nelson and going to Selkirk College. And then from Selkirk College, getting on a transfer and then going to the hospital or going to Castlegar or going to Trail. And then coming back, right? So again, ridership is not, if you look at the ridership in that context, well, the city of Nelson should pay for most of the 99. But functionally, nobody can agree with that. Like, nobody sees that working, in particular the city of Nelson, right? Like that would be egregious. I think there has to be a multi-factor approach. It has to take into account a couple different things. I believe the hybrid approach actually addresses that. I think it leaves space to look, so service partners can sit down, because while I appreciate that you have concerns around the list of services that we've identified Area K participating in, the impact of Area K saying, no, I don't participate in those services is very real for the village of Nakusp. It's very real for Silverton, New Denver, defined Area H. That's a conversation among service participants. That's where that really has to happen. That can't be staff dictating that with a model. That has to be a conversation within sort of the community of participants.
Thank you.
Thanks, Director Weatherhead. Director Cunningham.
Thank you, Chair. Through the chair, as you know, I've mentioned before what they do down in Vancouver, right? You flash your credit card or your bus pass at this little machine or at the bus door or wherever when you get on, and then you flash it again when you get off, and the computer records where you've gone, how far you've used, how long you've used the system, so you can get off and go shopping for 5 hours. But if you don't peg in or out, you're going to be paying for that. But basically, it's a question of where you go, how much you use. And so therefore the ridership, even though the riders don't pay the entire cost, because of course we pay much of it out of taxes, we certainly know where the riders are. The kinds of questions that have been asked here, which is how many of the riders from Area K actually use the other two services? We don't know. How many ones from Nakusp actually use the Area K services? We don't know. And I just use that as an example. In my case, of course, how many of the people from Salmo or Weimar actually get to go to the hospital and trail, which by the way is a 2-day run, or how many of them just go to Nelson? And would they be better off going to Fruitvale? Because we can't go to Fruitvale because we have no service. But all those kinds of things are helpful if you know that 90% of the people who get on the bus in Salmo just go as far as Weimar, but the bus keeps on going to Nelson with 2 people on it. So you can find out all those very interesting things if you had some way of, like I said, telling when they get off and when they get on, and having them pay by as measure of time and distance. And we can set the time and distance rates for different routes as we wish. I don't expect we can see anything that electronic and that well defined to make life that easy, but it certainly lets us know exactly all the questions that have been asked. And for example, if we're talking about Director Watson's area, for example, and you talk about the north and you find out there are only 2 people a month who actually get on the bus at the top and end up in Nelson, you know, well, that's a different kind of rate structure and a different kind of service. And so you can marry the service to the amount of need. So if everybody's taking the 5 o'clock bus, good, make a bigger bus then, or change the ride, you know, we can adapt things to need and distance and make all those kinds of fine changes. So having said that, most off with my dream, I'd like to make I think what we're doing right now with the idea of setting this thing together with some parameter changes is fine. And this is where we should go. We recognize that the time is getting on and that we cannot go too much longer. So I'm going to ask through the chair, do we need a motion or a direction as to where we need to go to Tom?
I have one more person on the list, and then I'll go back to Director Page. I think his intention was to make a motion, but I just want to make sure we finish Tom's slides. He had one last slide, I believe, and then we'll get to the motion. Okay?
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Director. Yeah. Director Lockwood, and then we'll jump to...
Mine's just clarification. So what I've heard is we want to have an apportionment figure, so you have something to work off of, to be able to come back to us, to be able to say, this is the true numbers, what we figured out. Now, with hearing all the other nuances of that there's only 2 riders here, or this does not connect with that, is all going to be worked out before we get to that next meeting. Sorry. We could go around in circles all day. We could be here for 12 hours discussing what isn't working. And I'm just trying to clarify, do we have enough information to go to the next level so we can have those nuanced conversations with our partners that are involved in it and staff to be able to figure out where it goes from there?
Respectfully through the chair, I think, in staff's opinion, I've made a recommendation based on the information provided. I think you have the information, and then that there's enough understanding in the room and online of what the potential for this model to equitably distribute the costs of public transit. Now, can we make changes to the model? Yes. Right? Can we amend it to have these sidebar conversations, as mentioned by Director Page, particularly around Locan seems to stand out, or to address concerns of Director Weatherhead regarding public transit costs? Yes, you can do those things because you have a method of apportionment. You cannot have any of those conversations without a method of apportionment, which is where we currently are. We can spend months talking about the things that need to happen, but there is no way to make that happen right now. And that's why, again, the apportionment piece, if the committee, there are two options on the table regarding recommendations for a mechanism of apportionment. If the committee chooses to proceed with those options, staff will do a bylaw describing the processes for apportionment, the mechanism, and the starting point. Okay, and then the committee will have the ability to then debate that. Right? There's enough that we've left a lot of room to really have to engage particular communities in transit. I think Castle D is a community. K and Cusp, certainly. There's the whole Valley Corridor, Alcott, like things. I would anticipate sitting down with people who have individual conversations. IJ Castlegar. This is the beginning of a process. We are nowhere near the end point right now.
Okay, good. Okay, I'm gonna go back to Director Page, I believe. So the first motion but there's two different recommendations. So I need to know, the first one is just specifically around the valley, right? Is that the right one? Yeah, around that. And then the second one actually talks more about what we're talking about right now. Did you have anything you wanted to add before we went to the recommendations? I think they're pretty clear.
They're pretty clear. There's
Okay.
the preferred recommendation and the alternative recommendation. The alternative recommendation is that we start with the current distribution of costs and move forward with the proposed apportionment method.
Okay, so in our agenda, you've got, I'm just making sure that we align what you're talking about with the agenda. So in the agenda, the first recommendation is actually talking about the electoral areas E and F in Slocan Valley Transit Establishment. So that's the part that you're talking about, taking Slocan and making that just for defined.
Yes, so what we would do is we would, with the bylaw for S238, service establishment bylaw is bylaw 1415. Bylaw 1415, we would limit strictly to the requisition of old E, old F, and old H. We would remove the village of Slocan as a participant. We would get rid of all the crazy apportionment stuff in there that doesn't really make a lot of sense. We would delink that from specific transit or anything, right? There's no need for any of that. It is overly confusing and it creates all kinds of budget overhead that we just don't need to do, okay? And then following S239, we would take S239 and we would amend S239 to include the proposed apportionment method and a baseline to start. So you would see that table with percentages in it, okay? And with that table with percentages, that would be the starting point for service levels. Then we would begin to have conversations that would probably result in those service level, in those percentages changing based on conversations.
Okay, so Director Page, you want to start with the first recommendation in the agenda, which just deals with the,
Before I do that,
yeah,
just because we haven't spoken to it, so you had offered out before the proposed and the alternate, as we could decide to go quickly, we could decide to go slowly, we could spend time creating management overhead over the next number of years, moving us in a direction of this model as service changes occurred, and we would steer towards it basically, or we could throw out what we're doing now and apply the model today and move forward. So before I propose one or the other, I would want to see if we want to have a discussion about just pulling the Band-Aid off, as I think is what it looks like, but it's simpler, it's cleaner, but there's a shock to the system in a certain way, and do we want to weather that or?
can I ask you a quick question, Tom, just to make sure we're separating those two recommendations?
Yeah.
The first recommendation isn't attached to that, or it is? Are both of these recommendations need that second layer of, are we doing it quick, are we doing it slow? Or is it just the second recommendation of?
Second recommendation is slow. The first layer, the first recommendation, to use the Band-Aid analogy.
No, like in the agenda. So in the agenda, you've got, right there, one is just talking about the old E, old F, and old H.
And then if you go down further, update the method of apportionment to protect the hybrid method. Yes.
Do you know what I mean? So
Yes.
does that one have to do with whether or not we're doing it fast or slow, or is that just a simple?
No, those two recommendations, because there's one recommendation for each bylaw.
So they both,
Okay.
they both have that conversation of are we doing this quick or slow?
Nope, you have to pick one. You have to pick one
Okay,
here.
for both.
That's right.
Got it.
So if you
Okay.
decide to go with the proposed method of apportionment initially, this is your recommendation. If you decide we need a different recommendation basically to get to the alternative.
Great, okay, just wanted to make sure that we were clear on if both of those things are intertwined. Yeah, totally take your point.
These describe the two different options. This is what's included basically in your agenda as the recommendation. This is the alternative.
So the preferred, just so I'm clear, because we covered a lot today. So the preferred or proposed option would be to do it quickly. Just move to the new level.
Respectfully through the chair, I think to start from a place of equity, or at least agree to, or the most equitable solution we can get to, I think is a better starting point, particularly because this is going to lead up to a conversation about service levels and a redistribution of those costs or an elimination or increase of costs. So, yeah.
So yes,
Yes.
thank you. I will move the first recommendation.
Great. Director Popoff, you want to second it since you were going to move it in the chat?
Yes, I will second it.
Okay, great. Okay, any discussion on that first recommendation? Okay, I'm not seeing any. Okay, so on that, then I will call the question and make sure you keep your hands up nice and high because I'm not sure it's going to be clear cut. So, all those in favor, I'll go in the room first. Everyone's good. Okay, in favor online. Put your hands up.
Chair,
nice
can
and
we
high.
get the presentation taken down so we can see what's going on online?
Sure, yeah.
Thank you.
Is that better? Okay, great. I'm gonna actually go to gallery mode now, just so I can actually see all of you. Okay, online, hold your hands up, great. Okay, the only one I can't see is Director
Yes.
Lunn. Oh, there you are. Director Lunn, in favor or opposed? Opposed, I see Silverton and Spokane opposed. Did I miss anyone else that was opposed? And Cunningham, are you opposed? Okay, and Cunningham. Okay, so I've got 3 opposed. You got those recorded.
Yeah. Oh, Silverton says they were in favor.
Oh, Silverton in favor. Okay, sorry, Silverton. So just Cunningham and Lunn opposed. Great. That passes. Great. That was a simpler vote than I thought it was gonna be. Great. I will move back. We don't think we have any public.
I think we have one more item for
The others.
Oh, is there?
Second-
What did I
Second
miss?
recommendation.
I thought we did both of them. One.
respectfully through the chair, I do have a recommendation of the seat from the committee, if I can discuss it briefly. And so this is irregular and I apologize, it didn't make it in here, but it's based on conversations we've had with DC Transit. DC Transit is seeking a mandate from the board to continue negotiations with Health Connections regarding the restoration and increase of Health Connections funding. So myself and DC Transit staff will be working to, again, further engage Health Connections. A signal from the board that this is a board mandated and we are directed to do this work would be a powerful statement, and it would be much appreciated by staff and DC Transit.
Director Watson?
So moved.
Second.
Great. Any further? Yeah, go for it.
Tom, would you be able to keep us apprised?
Absolutely.
And note when you might need to request political support for that?
Yeah.
Noting the centralization of healthcare, I think I described earlier, the residents from Argenta using the bus system to go to chemo treatments and trail, having 14 to 16 hours on the bus to do so. And when they moved to Argenta, there was a hospital in Caslo, so they didn't choose to do their blah, blah, blah. Anyways, please do things.
Okay, any other discussion on that motion? Not seeing any. All those in favor? Okay. And any opposed? Not seeing any. Director Hanegraaff, did you have something you need?
What happened to the second recommendation?
So that's why I was asking, so in this, there's actually, I think they're intertwined, in our agenda, they're separated into two
Okay.
recommendations.
Yeah.
So what we did, the one that's in our, which is what Director Page moved, was the one in the report that covered both the recommendations in the
Okay.
agenda.
Well, that's a very confusing way to do this.
Yeah,
I was just like,
that's okay. That's why I was asking the difference between
It's
the two
true to
pieces.
form for this committee, I'm gonna say, but there's a confusing way to do it.
Respectfully through the chair, we're experimenting with a new report template as well. And it kind of changed the requirements for me for organizing information. We're right in this transition period. I've been bringing feedback back to the senior management team regarding the template. And so hopefully that will be resolved so that you will see all the recommendations as opposed to just the preferred option.
Well, the problem is the agenda splits it into two recommendations, right? But the report put it in one, so just do.
Moving forward, I will keep them aligned, however, right? We'll pick a lane.
Okay.
Great, thanks.
well, I'm just wondering, at the board, these are recommendations to the board anyway. But these are two different bylaws, so is that the procedure?
Do we need two different motions?
Yes, you would at the board.
Okay, so we're,
That'll get fixed, because we propose a recommendation.
Likely they were probably separated because they're two separate bylaws. Sorry, I didn't catch that. So when Ange gets the minutes from Carly, she will likely separate those so that it's correct at board.
Good enough for me.
good enough for committee is exactly right. Otherwise I'd go back and redo all the votes, but we're not. I think we'll be okay moving it to board and it'll be separated at board, and it'll be two separate votes. Great, okay, is there anything else that needed to be on here okay, great, excellent. I don't believe we have any do we have public on the line, or are they all staff? I'm not sure who's on the line there. I'm not sure who Doug is either. Public, if you're on the line, you're welcome to unmute and ask us any questions if you have any at this time. Okay, I'm not seeing any, so I call for adjournment. Jackman, you want to argue about that? Okay, all those in favor? Right. Okay, bye everyone online. Thank you.
Wow.